This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Good morning. Excuse me, Dan and Amy. And the signature hysterics from the left over Brett Kavanaugh have begun in earnest. And the appeasing of the base is being done by Senate leaders, starting with Minority Leader Pagliacci, who is going to give everything he's got.
President Trump, with the nomination of Judge Kavanaugh, has fulfilled or is fulfilling two of his campaign promises. First, to undo women's reproductive freedom. Second, to undo ACA. And so I will oppose him with everything I've got.
With the heat of 1,000 suns.
Yeah, something like that.
I'm going to do it.
And Kamala Harris, flying in formation.
Listen, if you are a young woman in America or you care about a young woman in America, pay close attention to this nomination. Pay close attention. Because Kavanaugh has made his purpose clear. He told us that when he was on that list of 25. He has told us that in every decision that he has made on the issue of choice.
Yes, he's made it clear that he believes in the separation of powers and the black letter of the Constitution, and that, of course, is an affront to big government Democrats. For more on this topic and more on what kind of jurist are we going to get with Brett Kavanaugh, what's the impact on the court? Because this is a guy who is going to get confirmed. And he's going to get confirmed relatively easily, if narrowly, because of just the partisan and political environment that we're in D.C. But for more on what kind of judge and kind of impact Kavanaugh is likely to have, we're pleased to be joined by Gary Schmitt, who's a resident scholar for the American Enterprise Institute, the Strategic Studies and Director of Program on American Citizenship. Gary, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
I'm glad to be on, and I'm also glad not to be in Chicago traffic.
Yes, exactly. Although it's the good news is we're depopulating here, so traffic is getting a little bit better. So with respect to Kavanaugh, you've had Mark Levin and Judge Napolitano really take him to task over his opinion in the Seven Sky case, the Obamacare case, and conservatives are a little gun shy. We've been David Soutered before. We don't want to be David Soutered again. I think a more well-founded concern is that he would be more of an incrementalist like Roberts, but I think that's even a little unfair to Kavanaugh, depending when you look at his record. I think he's much more committed to originalism than Judge Roberts ever was. But your assessment of Kavanaugh as a jurist and the impact he'll have on the court.
Yeah, I mean, to start with, unlike Souter, I mean, we do have, 12 years of Kavanaugh's record on the appeals court and the appellate court in D.C., and I think there's something like 300 opinions. So, Kavanaugh's, views about how to think about being a judge are out there for everybody to read. And I think the folks from the conservative side that are picking at some of these cases, there's two things. One, I think it shows that Kavanaugh actually isn't simply a by-the-book, ideologue. But the second thing I think is sometimes they fail to recognize is that on the appeals court, your opinions really, you're supposed to be tied to precedents. And so I think Kavanaugh in some of these cases is basically trying to make the best of a situation where the precedents are what they are and deal with them that way. So, but in general, he, as one would want, he's not somebody who's in favor of the so-called living constitution. He's made that very clear in his writings and speeches and in the court opinion. So he's by far the most established and by far the most clear-headed of the candidates that President Trump could have picked.
Are we surprised, though, that he picked him, considering how President Trump feels about the Bushes, and also that he is, as many describe, a D.C. insider, born and raised there. His mom's a prosecutor there. Do you think that's going to affect any decision making?
I think that's passed. I think there's another side to Donald Trump, which is that he likes that credential stuff, and Brett Kavanaugh was educated at Yale, got his law degree at Yale, has taught at Harvard and at Yale and Georgetown. So there's two sides to that. There's the Trump, let's not. I mean, one reason why Brett Kavanaugh wasn't on the original list was because it was thought he's part of the D.C. appellate court, so therefore it's got to be not a good thing. But then I think Trump was convinced to put him on the list over the last couple of years because inside the White House, the lawyers that advised Trump would all know Kavanaugh and know what a fine record he has. So I think they've overcome that.
Given the left's rhetoric on Kavanaugh, and not surprising, but nonetheless unbridled and unhinged. Do you think that, based on what they believe about Kavanaugh, that he's going to lead to the deaths of people, that Justice Kagan should be impeached for hiring him at Harvard?
I mean, what's funny about this is that, again, Kavanaugh is well known among all kinds of lawyers, left and right, and because of his years here in town, but also other things he's done. And to a T, they all find him to be just having a very sound judicial temperament. That is, he doesn't sort of yell and scream at everybody. And also, he's just a very fine guy, and he's seen as such, down to earth. And so, if you were to ask, 80-90% of the liberal lawyers or judges that he's come in contact with, they would all sort of say he's a fine guy. But, of course, none of that's going to matter when it comes to how the Senate Democrats are going to act about it. They're going to act like the world's ending if he gets onto the court. And the truth is, it is a big change. I mean, as much as Kavanaugh was a clerk for Kennedy, he's not Kennedy-like in how he'll approach a lot of key issues. And so there will be, I think, changes made to all kinds of decisions that would have probably shifted center-left in a lot of cases, and they'll be moving to the center-right if Kavanaugh's on the court.
Well, speaking of that, how Kavanaugh was a clerk for Justice Kennedy, I don't know if you read the reports yesterday from NBC, but they were suggesting that Justice Kennedy retired because he would be more comfortable if he was replaced by a former clerk, and that he had a deal made with President Trump.
Totally unfounded reporting that they later essentially walked back.
Did they walk it back?
Yeah, it started to.
Yeah, and also I got to say, anybody who's dealt with President Trump on any kind of issues, the idea that, one day you've got an agreement with him and that's possibly going to stay the next day is a little bit foolish. So, no, I mean, I'm sure Justice Kennedy, again, Brett Kavanaugh, again, emphasizes too much, is just a really fine guy. And so I'm sure Kennedy thinks that, it would be perfectly fine for Kavanaugh to replace him, even if they don't totally agree about, key issues that the court may face.
Well, one of the key issues is going to be abortion. And, of course, Kennedy was, from my point of view, on the wrong side in Casey. And this is Ross Douthat has an interesting piece in the New York Times on this topic about the current Republican coalition, and without its Federalist Society and its all intellectually impressive work, wouldn't have millions of voters in its corner. At the heart of the promise is a pledge that what happened in Casey, when these Republican-appointed jurists limited Roe's ambit, but basically upheld his vision, will never happen again. And he is pretty optimistic that the Roberts-Kavanaugh court will vindicate the trust pro-lifers are placing in it. Others, including Andy McCarthy at National Review, are not so convinced. But he suggests that one way or the other, the landscape on abortion is going to change, because either that trust is going to be vindicated by Kavanaugh and this court, or it's not, and that's going to have huge electoral consequences. Do you agree with that?
Well, yeah, I think Kavanaugh, given what he's written and what he's in various opinions, but also what he's done in lectures, he obviously thinks Roe v. Wade, whatever the final judgment was, that the opinion itself, the constitutional character of the opinion is is dubious. Having said that, I also think Kavanaugh is very aware that the court has to be careful that he just can't go in willy-nilly, just sort of taking precedents that have been in existence for so many years now and just toss them out. That's the kind of thing the Warren Court did, and it cost the court its legitimacy for years until William Rehnquist could sort of settle things back down. So there's a tension between, I think, Kavanaugh thinking that Roe v. Wade's underlying rationale constitutionally is pretty dubious, but on the other hand, he's very aware of how the court has to behave in making adjustments. I think what you'll see, in fact, is the court using the issue of federalism to allow states to modify abortion rights in a way that they think is reasonable. The court will still have to make decisions about whether that's reasonable or not, but I think there'll be more leeway for the states under this court, if Kavanaugh is on the court, to have more say over abortion rights.
On the issue of the Federalist Society, since you work for a think tank and you're part of kind of the tapestry of think tanks, and
I'm deeply in the swamp.
Yeah, well, but David Brooks had a pretty good piece, and it's not something I say with frequency about Brooks, but about Kavanaugh, but about the Federalist Society in particular, which has been raised in profile because of the list of 25 and Leonard Leo's involvement, and they're now being targeted by the left, which tells you how effective they are. But one of the things he says, sort of a lesson for conservative grassroots in any organization generally, but I'm applying it to conservative grassroots. He says of the Federalist Society, if you emphasize professional excellence first, if you gain a foothold in society's mainstream institutions, if you build a cohesive band of brothers and sisters, you can transform the landscape of your field. He's essentially arguing about the intellectual heft that was brought to developing conservative legal talent for the express purpose of judgeships and ultimately Supreme Court justices. And 35 years after its founding, the Federalist Society is having this impact because they took this approach organizationally.
Yeah, I mean, one of my mentors, I have a PhD from University of Chicago, but one of my mentors when I was getting that PhD was Anton Scalia, who was teaching the law school at the time. And what was always struck me is the degree to which the Federalist Society folks were very conscious of not so much, sort of making themselves a movement at the beginning, but very conscious about sort of having lively discussions and debates about the substance of the law and the Constitution. It still goes on today. If you go to a Federalist Society meeting, let's say deregulation, you'll have 3 or 4 guys. They're conservative, but they won't necessarily disagree with each other or agree with each other, and so you have this very interesting intellectual exchange. So it's this combination of having the Federalist Society be an association where people get to know each other and be able to promote each other. But at the same time, it only really works because the intellectual heft of the organization is what it is, and it's not one that just is simply kind of a political action committee. It's much more of a intellectual effort on their part to make sure that conservatives, have deep thoughts about what they're doing in this particular profession. So it's a remarkable organization, that's for sure.
He is Gary Schmitt, Director of Program on American Citizenship and resident scholar for the American Enterprise Institute. Gary, thanks for joining us. Appreciate your insights.
Thanks for having me on.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.